Hello, all. Welcome to the Exposing Grief YouTube channel, where we begin to remove that stigma of grief and expose it for what it truly is, which is a natural and healthy way of living and loving. I'm bringing another bonus video to you this month for a couple of different reasons. One, last month in the bonus video, we talked about why anxiety is even part of grief. And one of those reasons was having anxiety around doing the grief work. And then I've also heard a lot of clients and just people around me asking about, what is that grief work? What does that mean? When we say doing the grief work, what does that mean? What are we implying? What are we saying? So I want to bring this bonus video to you to talk a little bit about what is doing the grief work and what that might look like specifically to you. So let's dive in. Okay, so first and foremost, let's talk about the definition of grief work, right? Like, that's the main question. Okay, I hear this concept of grief work, but I have no idea what that means. What does it mean? I have defined grief work as the following: the process in which one begins to grow around his, her, or their grief and develops an ability to carry the loss with him, her, or them. Cool. What does that mean? Let's break it down. So let's first talk about this idea or the process of growing around our grief. I want to show you this really cool visual that I think does a really great job of understanding and explaining what growing around our grief means. So if you look at the top, you'll see this idea that people tend to believe that grief shrinks over time. So we have the same size jar throughout all, but the ball representing the grief gets smaller. When in reality, we really learn to grow around our grief. So the grief stays the same, but us and our resources and our ability to manage gets bigger. We grow, we improve, while the grief just hangs out, right? And as our jar gets bigger and as we grow, we have more room for other things. So this is what I mean by the process in which we grow around our grief. This is the process in which we build your jar. We make it bigger. We expand it. We upgrade you, however you want to look at it. Now, this other half of the definition, the piece of learning and developing an ability to carry the loss with yourself, this is the idea of, how do I continue to bring that person with me? Sure, they may not be here, but they can still be part of my life. And what does that look like? So anytime we are doing grief work, we are working on building our jar, upgrading to a bigger jar, growing around that grief. And then we are learning, how do we stay connected? How do I still carry my person with me, even though they may physically not be here? Okay, so now we have an understanding of what the grief work means from a definition standpoint. Let's talk about what grief work means from a visual standpoint, right? Let's really start painting that picture of, what is this work going to look like? Keep in mind, everybody's picture and painting is going to be a little bit different based on where they are in their grief process, the type of loss they've experienced, and how that might influence their grief. For everyone, flat out, first and foremost, the grief work is going to entail making sure you've got a good support system, a healthy, safe support system, making sure you have resources outside of your grief counseling or whatever other guidance you're getting, making sure you just have things to help keep you stable, right? Coping mechanisms, grounding techniques, because the grief work is going to be challenging. It's going to be hard. So we want to make sure we have that foundation that is going to carry you through doing the grief work, which is going to allow you to grow around your grief. Once we have all those established, we have that foundation built, we then go into a couple of different things. For some people, it might be all of these. For some people, it might just be one or two. Part of the grief work might be this meaning making work. So that can be asking those questions of, why now? Why me? Why this way? What if? What would have happened if I had done A, B, or C? For some people, it might be exploring what legacy of their loved ones they want to carry on. For others, that meaning making work might be that question of, who am I? I have no idea who I am without this person now. What do I do? So Some people's grief work may entail exploring that meaning making and finding that meaning. For others, or in addition to that, it may be trauma work. For those who have experienced a sudden loss or a traumatic loss, there's trauma attached to that that's influencing our grief and our ability to do the grief work. So it is important to make space to do that trauma work. So these are some of the things, again, not everybody's process will look the same, but these are some of the things that might develop or start painting that picture of what doing the grief work looks like. There are other things as well that I haven't listed, but these are just some of the main ones that I come across. So this is how we start beginning to paint that picture of the grief work and allowing you to start growing around your grief. Let's now talk about this second piece of that definition of grief work, which is carrying the loss with us, developing the ability to do so. What does that look like? What do I mean by that? Simply, what carrying the loss means is staying connected to our loved ones, those continued bonds. Even though they are physically not here, how do I continue to stay connected and engage in a relationship with this person mentally and emotionally? I understand it's hard. A lot of times when I talk about this with clients, they say, but I don't want that connection. Like, that's great and all that we can do that. I don't want that connection. I want the physical connection. Absolutely. Of course you do. Why wouldn't you? 100%. So when you've reached the appropriate point in your grief work to start exploring this, we start to look at how can you feel connected to your loved ones? And that looks different for everybody. It could be a religious, a spiritual, something totally outside of that. We spend time exploring what really resonates with you. Because this is kind of a tricky concept to grasp, I like to use the metaphor of a chapter book. When we read and finish a chapter, we don't go, okay, on the book, it's done forever, right? We don't totally remove that chapter from the rest of the book. The content in that chapter carries on throughout the rest of the book to create a beautiful, complete story. So I want to encourage the loss of a loved one being seen as a chapter book of this loss is part of your book. This is a chapter, a very important chapter, and one that is very valid and deserves to have a bunch of time given to it. It is a chapter in your book that is going to allow you to carry all of that stuff that's happening in this chapter with your loved one through the rest of your beautiful story, right? Exploring different ways to implement the elements of this chapter, which is your loved one, the relationship with your loved one, implementing that into other areas, other chapters of your book to continue to create this beautiful story. Sure, we're going to have to rewrite some of it because it maybe didn't turn out the way we wanted it to. We do work around that. So I want to encourage you to explore and look at continuing the relationship with your loved one as continuing a chapter book. It continues on. The story may change a bit. Your loved one's always going to be there. Your relationship with your loved one is always going to be there. That they cannot take away. It's just going to look different. And we get to choose how that looks different, how we get to stay connected to our loved one, so we can still feel like they're a very important part of our life, because they are. So that is what I mean by carrying that loss with us. Okay, recap of all the stuff we've talked about. So that the definition of grief work is the process in which one begins to grow around his, her, or their grief and develops an ability to carry the loss with him, her, or them. By growing around the grief, we mean building our jar up and upgrading our jar as opposed to shrinking the grief. And by carrying the loss with us, we mean staying connected to our loved one, exploring all the different beautiful ways that we can maintain a relationship with our loved one even after they're physically gone. So the next time you hear, I'm doing my grief work, I need to do my grief work, what does your grief work entail? You kind of have a baseline for what that might look like. If you want to start exploring your grief work or you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email is below. You can check out my website. Don't forget to subscribe to the Exposing Grief YouTube channel. And thank you so much for joining me for this bonus video. And I look forward to bringing you the interview later this month. Have an awesome February.